2008. She is currently an associate professor in the geography department at Indiana University. Her work combines political ecology, science and technology studies, and fluvial geomorphology as part of a new field, critical physical geography. Dr. Lave is the author of Fields and Streams, Stream Restoration, Neoliberalism, and the Future of Environmental Science, so rush right out and buy that book. She is also co-editing 2 books expected to be published in 2017. We're waiting. The Handbook of Critical Physical Geography and the Handbook of Political Economy of Science. She's won numerous teaching awards, like a lot of them. She's published in various journals, lots of articles. And we are especially glad to have Dr. Lave's repeated participation and support. This is her 5th time attending DOPE. She only missed the very first one. We don't hold that against her. So that's enough of me. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lave.
It is really, really lovely to be here. Let me just say that one of the things I love about DOPE is how many people that I love are here. I have hugged so many people this morning, I have a static charge. So the next person to hug me, watch out. Okay, so I am going to be talking today more broadly about knowledge politics. And it's funny, a half-hour talk is sort of an interesting hybrid between like the one point you can make in a conference talk and then the more complex thing you can say in a big talk. So we'll see how this goes. All right, so the core argument that I'm going to make today, the kind of big project that I've been engaged in since the early 2000s, is thinking about the political economy of knowledge production. Okay, so the point that you're going to hear throughout this talk is that it's not just what science claims, but how it arrives at its conclusions that matter. Okay, because it has to do with the questions we ask and also those that we ignore. Okay, probably more importantly, the ignore part. It has to do with who gets to ask those questions and who gets to answer them. Okay? And I'm going to argue to you today that it profoundly matters both outside and inside the university, okay? And that it matters not just for our theoretical analyses, but also for our political actions in the world. So, quick overview, the roadmap of where we're going. I'm going to begin by talking about this current moment of upheaval. Okay, what is happening with the production of authority, the organization of universities, the organization of knowledge production more broadly. Then I'll talk about what that looks like inside and outside the university. And then this last section is actually going to be a long section. It's not a sort of short, here's my wrap-up point, everybody can like tune out now. This is going to be a sort of political ecology heresy a little bit of what are the concrete things we can do. Yeah? All right. It's possible that my Berkeley degree will be retroactively pulled for this, but we're going to hope not. All right, here we go. Actually, before I go, is everybody hearing me okay? Brilliant. The mic was so horrible, I just could not even deal with it. So we're going to run with this. All right, so first of all, what is going on with the production of authority right now? Okay. Anybody looking through the literature on STS, Social Studies of Science, is going to see numerous laments about the decline of academic authority. Okay, you can see it in natural science journals, you can see it everywhere. Lots of different hypotheses about why. Okay, Ulrich Beck says it is the fault of all of these horrible scientific catastrophes of the 20th century. That's why science has lost its authority. Okay, Bruno Latour says, it's really that us STS people have been too successful. Okay, with social constructivism, and we've undermined the bases for all authority. Okay? Really, he really does say that. You can read it. 2004, I don't have the site in my head, but I'll email it to you if you want it. Okay, Phil Murawski says, idiots, it's neoliberalism, it's the economy, right? So there are many, many explanations for what is going on here. What is very clear is that we are seeing the rise of a new science regime, and this is a term that comes from a French historian of science named Dominique Pestre that I find really useful, so I'm just going to take a minute to talk about what a science regime is and why it would matter. So just quickly on Dominique Pestre, he works with like the kind of dawn of science, so like 15th, 16th, 17th century science. Okay. What he argues is that science has always been of interest to elites, okay, as a project of control, so that in any given historical period or area, what you have is a specific configuration of overlapping interests by often the military, economic elite, okay, who shape where science takes place, but also who practices and what kinds of questions they answer. Okay, and what he's arguing, which I think is extremely important at this moment when we're all talking about loss of scientific autonomy, okay, what he argues is that scientists have never operated under conditions of their own choosing. Okay, so part of the upset about what's happening right now is based on a just mistaken understanding of the history of science. Okay, so I did a little bit of this already, but what do science regimes do? They affect not just conditions of production, but very importantly for the kinds of things I care about, they affect the actual content of science. Okay? So which topics are appropriate for scientific inquiry and which get you branded a crackpot? Okay? What are the key concepts that get used? I mean, as folks like, there's Nathan Sayers, for example, beautiful article about the kind of racist, eugenicist, colonial roots of the concept of carrying capacity. Okay? The concepts that we use carry political baggage, and if they don't fit with the political frameworks we're working at, it's much harder to employ them, right? So some of the key concepts we use that feel very neutral to us, okay? Actually, I'm not fair to implicate that you and that us, but concepts that I studied in college and grad school that I took to be very neutral turned out not to be, okay? What gets included, those of you who do modeling, what gets included in models and what doesn't? Okay? Who's considered authoritative and credible? Okay, 100 years ago, this would not have been me standing up here talking to you. All right, so why can I stand up here and talk to you now? What we are in at the moment is very clearly a transition between the Cold War science regime, which dominated in the US after the 1940s, okay, up through the beginning of the 80s, and something else. Okay, and as someone who has a very strong commitment to political economy, I'm going to argue that's a neoliberal science regime. Okay, so then what does that look like? Now, Phil Murawski and others have argued that science policy turns out to be surprisingly central to neoliberal policy agendas. Now, this is weird. Okay, if you think about our economic system, the amount of money that gets spent on education and science is really quite small, right? It makes sense that there'd be a big project to neoliberalize public education, K through 12. It makes sense that there would be a big project to neoliberalize public health, for example. Why the university? Okay, what Murawski has argued to me very convincingly is that neoliberalism is based on an epistemological argument about what it's possible to know and how things are constructed. And what it says is that the market is the superior information processor, okay? Far better than any individual. What that means is you and me, the university we're sitting in, we are at best misguided, okay? And at worst, we are actively detrimental to the construction of the society that neoliberal policy is aiming for. Okay? So what that means is that the attacks that we're seeing on public funding for universities and things like that now, those things are not new. Okay? Folks like Milton Friedman, Hayek himself, were making attacks on the public education system in the US and in other places for decades. Okay? So, how does this work inside the academy and outside the academy? What's happening? Right? So inside the academy, what we have is a process, okay? Everybody in here, I'm assuming, is going to be familiar with the idea of neoliberalization, right? The idea that however neoliberal policies come in, they're going to have to interact with what's already there, because it's not like it's a vacuum, a clean slate on which neoliberal policies just get written, okay? So how this is playing out is in very nationally specific ways, okay? Whatever a neoliberal science regime is, it looks different here than it does in France, than it does in Argentina, okay, one. It varies by discipline and even by campus how people are responding to it and what happens. But there are some key commonalities that I'm going to run through briefly. So first, we get amazing reduction of funding for public universities across almost the entire OECD. Right? And what that means, which I'm sure everyone in this room has felt, is the transition of the way that we pay for universities from public funding to private funding. Y'all are expected to pay for yourselves now because education is no longer framed as a public good that produces the informed citizens that we all need, okay? And instead it is now framed as you investing in your human capital. And why would I pay for your human capital? No reason for me to do that. It doesn't help me. Okay, so we get this reframing of public funding and a resulting massive, massive round of cuts. Okay, such that most public universities in the US are now looking at like 17% or lower public funding, which is a really, really big shift over a very short time period. All right, another thing to point to is the separation of research and teaching. Okay, in the US, we experience this as the adjunct apocalypse. Okay? In Europe and England, what we're seeing instead is research assessment exercises, which I will discuss in a moment, okay, being used to separate out universities rather than faculty at particular universities from universities that are focused on teaching versus universities that are focused on research. Okay? All right. We see what I and many other people have referred to as the tyranny of relevance, okay? Which is the idea that our research is supposed to be reconfigured to meet market-based or practical ends, okay, which is a real big problem for people in the humanities, people in the basic sciences, and some parts of the social sciences. Okay? Fourth thing is what's happening to how academic work gets vetted. Okay? We're used to the idea of peer review. Peer review has many, many, many flaws. Okay? Any academic you talk to will tell you any number of horror stories about peer review, but, okay, it's got to be better than paying for it. Right? So what's happening now is that we're getting the beginnings of commercialization of peer review through things like the Faculty of 1000, where you're literally paying for reviews. Okay? Sergio Sismondo's done this amazing work about what's happening in medical publishing, where he's arguing that medical companies, and he has interview data and things where the companies are just talking to him about this. They are not just ghost writing the articles, they are ghost managing the entire process of how the clinical trial data gets collected, how it gets written up, where it gets published, so that his estimates are that about 40% of the medical academic literature that is published in the US is produced not by the academics whose names are on it, but by marketing arms of major pharmaceutical companies. Okay, we also have entire fake journals. I don't know if you caught that, but Elsevier was publishing, 6 or 7 fake medical journals that were, they looked like peer review journals. They said they had a review board, the whole thing, that in fact were just marketing materials for pharmaceutical companies. Okay, so the key thing that I want you to get here is this idea that how we determine the quality, how we decide what's good in terms of scientific knowledge claims is shifting. Okay? So that market take-up and sort of commercial credentials are becoming a very positive thing in terms of how knowledge is viewed. Last thing I want to talk to you about in terms of what's happening inside the economy is, inside the university, let me try that one more time, okay, is the incredible fortification of intellectual property. We're used to talking about it in terms of patents. For those of you that don't have connections to the natural sciences, what's having a far, far bigger impact on research is something called the Material Transfer Agreement, okay, which controls access to particular proprietary research materials and techniques. Okay, and what's happening, MTAs are agreements between universities. So University of Kentucky says to Indiana University, okay, you can't use this particular technique unless you pay me for it, and unless I get a slice of future profits from anything that comes out of it. Okay, so universities are starting to block other universities from research in ways that are having really intense impacts on what people can research. Okay, natural scientists are angry enough about this that they're doing their own social science research, which I find wonderful. They are interviewing each other and surveying each other and publishing articles saying, 80% of microbiologists say that MTAs have hampered their research, have blocked them from a line of research in the last 2 years. Right, so this is a big deal. Okay, so inside the academy. What's going on outside the academy? Couple different things I want to point to. Okay, so the first one is some really intense, deep injustices. Right, and I'm just going to give 2 examples. I am sure that those of you in this room could give many more. Right, but these are the 2 that I want to point to quickly. First one is based on Lee Johnson's work on hurricane forecasting. Okay, so she was studying how academics at public universities are getting encouraged/pressured to develop commercial spin-offs of their work. Okay, so there's a set of hurricane forecasters who've developed models that are far better than what the National Weather Service has. Okay. They are doing under contract for major Gulf oil companies. They have been able to figure out how to predict the path of hurricanes and the intensity of hurricanes with far greater accuracy and far ahead of time. Okay? So right now, if you were a Gulf oil company who commissioned these researchers from the University of Georgia, I believe, you will know with 3 days advance warning the path of the hurricane and its intensity. Right now with the National Weather Service, we get about 24 hours, and it's not that great of a predictor, okay? Think about how the stories we tell, I don't want to talk about the stories. Think about how the material reality of Hurricane Katrina, how different it could have been if New Orleans had had 3 days warning that it was going to be a Category 5 and a direct hit. Okay, this is a big deal. Okay? The second example I want to point to is the privatization of clinical trials. Okay, we're moving them, we're privatizing them, and we're moving them out of the US into countries where it's cheaper to do it. So Kaushik Sundararajan has some really intense work just that I'm going to shorthand really briefly by saying, oh look, you expropriate people's land, they have no way to make money, guess what they do? They're much more willing to volunteer for your clinical trials now because they're going to get some money. Okay, so this kind of dialectic between expropriation and primitive accumulation. Right? Another thing I want to point to is this, and this goes hand in hand with the commercialization of peer review, okay, is more credibility for private sector science. Okay, the idea that instead of it being a stigma that you have a commercial conflict of interest, that in fact it's actually seen as a positive, right? Because if people will pay for your knowledge claims, they got to be good. Right? They got to be better than my knowledge claim that nobody's paying me for. Because if it was good, somebody would buy it. Okay? So market uptake is proving validity. All right. 2 things that worry me deeply. Let me talk to you about a flip side. All right? The credibility doesn't only go to commercial actors. Okay? There are a lot of people outside the university that are producing different knowledge claims. Okay, and they're getting credibility spread around a lot of different places. Okay, and we can talk about how this has developed historically in the 1980s with the beginnings of recognition for First Nations in Canada, okay, that they should be involved in environmental management decisions. You can talk about how various activist science groups, citizen science groups, are starting to be able to consult with regulators about decisions that affect their communities. The Environmental Working Group gets covered in the Wall Street Journal when it releases its annual reviews of products. Public Lab, which is this awesome DIY kind of critical hacking group, okay, they are helping people to develop their own cheap sensing tools, and that data is getting used by the EPA, by FEMA, okay, in regulatory actions, which is huge. Okay, is this perfect? Are they suddenly as credible as somebody employed at MIT? No. Okay, but it's a big shift, right? And it's an important one, okay? And I think since most of us in this room have been alive during the period when this was shifting, it may not be clear to you how big of a shift this is. Okay, but it's actually really huge. So I'm going to just do like 2 quick slides on the history of science produced outside the academy for those of you for whom this is not familiar. Okay? So, as late as the mid to late 1800s, the boundaries between who was considered a legitimate scientist, like a full-time scientist, and who was a part-time scientist were much, much, much more fluid. Okay? What we had was this shared community of knowledge production, okay, that produced collections together, that published together, that were in learned societies together. Okay? We're talking about science that was produced in public places. Okay, one of my absolute favorite history of science articles, Anne Secord, which I have to say very carefully, not Anna Secord, Anne Secord, okay, in 1994, did this great article called Science in the Pubs about whole movements in northern England of workers who would get together once a week in bars, okay, to do botanical knowledge production, and for a small fee, the landlord held their collections. Their kind of membership fees went to buy books. Okay, science used to be a public thing. It didn't used to get squirreled away in labs, right? So we had these interdependent collections, interdependent knowledge production, okay, that was kind of this unified community. And I don't want to minimize the fact that there were, of course, race, class, gender differences going on here, right? But the point was that you weren't automatically disqualified from knowledge production by those things. Now, in the mid-1800s, we get a process of professionalization as the sciences try to establish themselves as legit. So we get the creation of societies and journals that are only open to full-time scientists, okay? All you amateurs, no longer. We start to get more emphasis on certification via university education, okay, which no one who's working full-time in a factory is going to be able to pull off at this time period. We get the turn to lab sciences. Okay, if the core of knowledge that everybody's working on involves going outside with a backpack, okay, lots of people can do that. If the core of knowledge production involves being in a clean lab with incredibly expensive equipment, basically everyone in this room is out, and we're doing pretty well financially. Okay? So this is a big problem. And then also the collections that have been assembled together get put into these private societies where all of a sudden you can't get access to them anymore. Okay? So this collectively produced body of knowledge gets recast as the product of full-time professionals, right? All the people that went into collecting it just get written out of that record, and they no longer have access to it. Why am I talking to you about this? Okay? History of science is great, but there's something that I really want you to take away from this, which is that this means that particular people's knowledge, experience, perspective gets written out of science. Okay, so let's just do call and response for a minute here, okay? Who gets ignored when we don't take indigenous ecological knowledge seriously? Indigenous folks. Okay, local knowledge. Who gets written out? I started with that one because I thought it would be easy. All right, local knowledge. Who gets written out? Usually, local knowledge applies to lower class white folks, in my experience in the literature, when people are talking local knowledge. Activist citizen science. Who are we losing? Activists. All right. I will just say, all right, with amateur science, you're losing women, you're losing working class people, okay, and we can just kind of go through this list as well. What it means is we get this profound narrowing of the agenda of science, the questions that get asked, how they get asked, and a different content. Okay, so I want to argue that this really matters. Okay, what do we do? I'm just going to warn you that the heading of this next slide is what's really going to get my degree pulled. You ready? All right, everybody ready? Here we go. All right. I don't know what's like in the field you're in geography. If you say this is not good news. But I actually really have an argument here. So we'll see if this flies. So the first thing I want to say is that a lot of the arguments about that are against the neoliberalization of the university have this incredible nostalgia for the pre-1980s university. And I would like you to take that nostalgia, wad it up into a ball, and throw it in the nearest garbage can. Not the recycling can. We don't want it to come back. Okay? So, yeah, no, really, people, we don't. Okay? So we're talking about a time period in which the faculty at universities was overwhelmingly white and male, as were the students. We're talking about a time when most of the funding came from defense spending, with all the crap that went with that. Okay, so there's a lot of bad stuff about this science regime that's ending that would make you want to stop a minute and think carefully about being nostalgic for it. All right? A couple things that I want to pull out that I think I actually, like about what's happening. Okay? One of them is the emphasis on relevance. Okay. Now, I get that for many disciplines this is a really bad thing. Okay? But I want to argue that for political ecology, this is actually something we should be aspiring to. All right? And, this is, I think, a big part of why I'm so looking forward to the final keynote of the conference with Tracy Osborne talking about public political ecology, right? To my mind, this is something we all need to be taking really seriously. Okay, so I don't think relevance is necessarily a bad thing. Okay? Yes, if they're telling me I have to be relevant to Pfizer or Merck or Lilly, okay, yeah, maybe not. All right, but if I can choose what that relevance looks like, that's good. Which brings me to my next point. One of the things that academics are really suffering under, particularly in Europe right now, is incredible audit requirements. What I want to point out is those audit requirements are a formal requirement in the sense of being relatively contentless. Okay, it's a structure you have to fit into, not a prescribed set of content things. In the US, for those of you who are teaching in American universities or graduate students in American universities, think about the whole new emphasis on learning assessment. Yeah, how all of a sudden we're supposed to have these objectives for every class, and we're supposed to measure them at the end, and we're supposed to produce rubrics that show that we can give to the administration, right? Yeah, you all know this, right? But no one says what those learning outcomes have to be, right? So in my department, what we did is we said, okay, our students need to understand the uneven distribution of resources and well-being across the world, and they need to be able to discuss that and think about social justice issues. And nobody said, you can't do that. And when we went to the workshops, we were working, the many departments were having to work through these together because we had to do them all at once because IU was about to lose its accreditation because we weren't doing them. and so here I am in this department with, in this meeting with like 20, 25 other departments, and I say, we're doing this, and people are like, what? You can do that? And I said, yes, you can. And I think then we kind of got, more departments, right? So similarly with the RAE in Britain, okay? Relevance is becoming, I'm forgetting, 35% of a university's score? It's something intense. But relevance isn't defined. So define it. Define it not as, ooh, I run off this many companies and increase stock value in this way. Define it as, I made these impacts on the well-being, the deep well-being of my community. Okay, so, all right, there's some room in here. Last of these I want to point to is that the erosion of academic authority is really uncomfortable for academics. You know, like, it is, it's hard, it's weird, it's not fun, okay? But it opens up a lot of potential. Okay, so what do I mean here? All right, I've done a lot of research on this. I'm not going to talk about it today. But what shows up to me really strongly is that academics are absolutely terrible at delegitimizing commercial knowledge. Right? In the cases I study, academics have been trying for years, actually for more than a decade in some cases, to tear down the credibility of commercial knowledge producers, and they have just failed. Like, they just failed. There's really no way around it. Like, you can't put a good face in it. They just lost. Okay? So, what that tells me is we should not be spending our time trying to tear down the commercial knowledge claims. I don't think we're going to be successful. What we can do really successfully, I think, is lend our credibility is not gone. It's just diminished. So lend that credibility to activist organizations whose values we want to run with. That we can do, okay? So, all right, my first go do this is go bolster the credibility of activists, all right? Okay, now, inside the university, this is data from last week from the Chronicle of Higher Education. Don't know if you saw this. And I added gender because it wasn't on there. It's funny, I didn't get how telling that was until this moment. Thank you all for that laugh. All right, so the full professor ranks actually give you a pretty good snapshot of what the university looked like 25 years ago when they started as professors, okay? So what we're seeing is a switch from, actually that shouldn't say today, so it was 80, the full professor, yeah, no, that's right. So think about this as a, let me try this one more time. Think about this as a way of getting a time analysis, but in a slide that's all about today. Is that clearer?
Yes.
Yes, all right. So what we're going from is a situation in which the full professors are 82% white and 75% male. Now this is about, 134,000 people in that bar. The assistant professor bar is not small though. It's 83,000 people, so that's what, about 3/5, somewhere in that range? Okay. Here we get 65% white and 54% male. Is that perfect? No. Is it better? I would say yes, okay? To me, that's a change, and it's important change. So how do we keep working on that change? Okay, what do we do to push this farther? So we clean our own house. We work on increasing the plurality of the academy along race, gender, class, sexual orientation, ability. I'm sure that I'm missing some on this slide. Okay, but we just start working on making this a more plural community. Okay, now those of you that are coming from disciplines other than geography, this may sound like a kind of big duh. But anybody, but let me just say that in a geography department, if you have 20% female faculty, you're considered to be actually a pretty good on that front, and I don't even want to talk about what the racial numbers of that would be. Okay, so actually I do want to talk about it, but I don't know. I don't think it's good, all right? And so it leads to these situations. I mean, should I tell the story? Yeah, I'm going to tell the story. It leads to situations where, like, there was the University of Georgia, they started trying to hire women in a serious way. And they did a big push, and then they got to 25% women, all right? And then another hire came up and they said, oh, well, what should we be doing? Should we be hiring more women? And one of the male faculty said, oh, but we fixed it. We're at equal numbers. To which my dear colleague there, who shall remain nameless, anybody from Georgia can tell you who it is, though, said, only if you count both of our breasts. All right. So geography has the whole university system has a problem, but geography has a bigger problem. Yeah, our profile is much more like, say, chemistry than anthro, okay? So, what can we do? The first two of these are really obvious. They're the ones that I certainly had thought about the most in previous years. They're things that many of you in this room don't have control over yet, but hopefully you will. Okay, so things like grad school admissions and hiring. I want to talk about things that I know everyone in this room can work on, though. Okay, so the first one will be conference organization. Okay, and I want to say, like, shining star on this is where you are at this moment. Okay, DOPE has, to my knowledge, consistently done the best of any of the larger medium-sized geography conferences at working on who they put up in front of an audience. Okay, so kudos to all of the graduate students who have gone through here over the years and organized these conferences, because y'all rock. Okay, we can do this at AAG too, though. We can work on this. We can work on who we ask to be in sessions, the kinds of calls we put out, okay, the room we open in them for alternate perspectives. Okay, so that's something that all of us can work on. Second thing all of us can work on is voting with our feet. What if David Harvey gave a session and nobody came? I mean, seriously, really, just imagine that for a minute. It would change the hierarchy of our field. Y'all giggle. Yeah, no, but I mean, really, just stop and sit with that for a minute. It is something that any of us can do. And I'm just gonna say, like, the ideas I'm putting up here are not because I think that I am some exemplar of these ideas, right? I went to the David Harvey session last year. It made me mad. And then I thought, wait, why was I here? Why did I do this? Why did I reinforce this structure with my body? That was really retrograde of me. So I'm turning over a new leaf, and I'm gonna encourage you, I'm sure you guys have probably already been doing this, but those of you that haven't, think about turning over this new leaf with me, all right? Last thing I wanna point to is citations. I have this blog on knowledge politics, and I've been thinking for a while about doing a citation on when bad citation practices happen to good people. And the problem with doing that is that it means I have to call out people I love, right? Because that whole good people thing right there already tells you that I'm talking about people who I love and admire. But I think it's something we all have to think about, because citation counts matter. I mean, this is part of that neoliberal audit culture thing, right? People look at your H index, and they think about you in relation to your H index, which is your number of citations versus your never mind, I'm not even gonna go in it. I don't love it, but it's there. Okay, the point is that people's citation counts matter. So if you wanna boost the work of something other than the usual suspects, cite them. And as a friend of mine, Kylie Pepler, says, if you stop to think about where concepts actually come from, most of the time you will discover that a woman or a person of color said it actually before the person we all always cite for them. Okay, so it may not actually be as hard as you think to do that. Like, you just need to think about it some. All right, so these were all things that I was thinking about as things we could do. All right, why? Why would you bother? Okay, none of this is easy, so why do you do it? Well, what I would argue is that we don't really know what this neoliberal science regime is going to look like. Okay, right now, the dominant discussion on university campuses is horror and helplessness. Okay, on my campus, the radical faculty are just like about ready to kind of throw in the towel and give up because it's so awful the way they're experiencing it. Okay, but my point is that we actually don't know what it's going to look like. Because of these formalized requirements, we can change the content and make it look like something that we would prefer. Okay, and I would argue that great guideposts for that would be, for example, universities in Chile and Argentina, who under dictatorship managed to keep radical scholarship going by changing the names they gave things. Okay, and I'm sure there were more things than that. I've just simplified a very complex and fraught process, and I don't mean it in any way disrespectful. My point is that we have guides for how to do this, right? There are people that have pulled this off. So we need to go to them and ask, how did you do this? And kind of think through it on our own campuses, what we can do to change what this looks like, because we're looking at a very scary possibility if we don't, right? We could have this like terrifying rule of commercially driven science, okay, where, for example, the only thing we know about fracking comes from gas companies, and the only thing we know about whether or not drugs work comes from the companies that are promoting them, and, right? This is not good. Or we might actually see a broadening out of who gets to make legitimate knowledge claims, okay? Which I may have problems with in other ways, but it's worth thinking about, okay? Last thing, and this is the last slide. The very basic claim of political ecology is that what we know matters, what we claim matters on the ground, right? This is Piers Blakey, this is Susanna Hecht 101. Colonial science matters, okay? What I have been trying to say in this talk is that how that knowledge is produced matters too, okay? And that the questions that are asked and answered in our world, which leads to the policies that we put in place and the way the landscape has changed, the way people are affected, it comes down to broader structural forces, absolutely, okay? But it also matters who does the asking. Okay, and that we can change. Thank you very much. I should say on these that I have had many conversations with many people on these topics over the years. What I threw up were the people that had the moments where I went, oh, what have I been doing? That's that list. Questions, comments, discussion?
Yeah, I think it might be worth talking about some of the models about how you go about this, because you can try and do this as an individual scholar, or you could try to approach this in a more collective fashion. So for example, in Northeastern, where we have public lab people, I direct the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaborative, and what we do is we bring in different organizations with academics. We have grad students and undergraduates and scholars from around who have the community who have a critical perspective. When we come together and we work like a collaborative, like a cooperative, we're not even, we look like a center. We produce more reports than the centers.
Yep.
Everyone thinks we're a center, they think we have a huge budget, but we have no budget. But we're incredibly effective because we sort of doing citizen science in a very dialectical fashion. And it's kind of hard to do that as an individual, but if you come together with others and create entities within the university, they don't know what the hell's going on. You create something before they realize it, and then they're getting good publicity, so they kind of like it, but they're a little nervous. But, so I think there's models about how you can go about doing this that are also worth thinking about.
I think you're 100% right, and we clearly need some kind of clearinghouse and way of talking about this, so we can share ideas across campuses, because that's an awesome model. And I would love to be able to bring it to other places, help it go to other places. So yeah, we need something. I'm not sure what that is, but yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Great talk. It's an honor to hear you. So with regard to dominant and alternative knowledge production, what's your perspective on land-grant colleges promoting conventional agriculture? And I guess what's the possibility of bringing in a more localized agroecological perspective into land-grant training?
I think there's enormous potential there. I really do, and you already see it in some places. And I work on streams and water quality more than crop stuff, so I'm just going to be able to address it from that angle. But at Ohio State, for example, there are guys in ag extension that are working with farmers to do very different physical formation of agricultural ditches in a way that looks like it really could improve water quality and deal with farmers flooding and kind of have a more combined good impact, right? I think there's tons of room for it. I really do. But I do think we all just need to infiltrate ag extension.
Is it mainly on that local county level that change can sort of come about?
That's happening. The person I'm speaking about at Ohio State, Andy Ward, he's having an impact actually at a state and beyond state level. So I really think that the doors are open here for this. I mean, I am there are obviously very different models about how you change an institution, right? There's the tear it down from inside and the infiltrate model, and I think you should do the one that suits your personality. Like I'm an infiltrator, that's where I am comfortable. And I feel like I don't know what to say about that, and this is true. All love to people who burn things down, it's not one of my life skills. So I must have missed the match day. But so I think that there's a lot of room for getting into those institutions and nudging, or even like shoving. But
I'm just curious. So we have this idea of citizen science having new room, which is fantastic. But as we have the sort of decline in funding for research, a lot of those same citizen science projects have to be funded through private funding and foundations and sort of funding sources with no public accountability and no public guarantee either. And so I don't know, I guess there's this sort of tension of the idea of neoliberalization isn't necessarily bad because of whose ideas can come out, but then where the money to actually support these ideas comes from.
yeah, it's a big question, right? And were you done with your?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I mean, I could also put up a slide that said neoliberalization isn't necessarily good, right? I mean, so I think, I feel like I'm maybe being a little repetitive here, but I think that it's up for grabs, right? And that there is room for people to push. I'm thinking about, for example, Kirk Jalbert, who just finished up at RPI in the STS program there, and is now working for an organization that organizes people to do volunteer water monitoring around fracking. Right, so there are people that are kind of putting their bodies in to shape which way it goes. But yes, the funding is an issue. There's also funding that's coming from universities for this, which comes with its own strings, right? This is part of why I find public lab inspiring, because I think if they can help people figure out how to do monitoring tools that are cheap enough, then maybe you won't need the funding. Yeah, but it's a really good point. Sophie.
Thanks for your talk. I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit about opening up expertise while also trying not to essentialize or romanticize kind of alternate forms of knowledge, or like necessarily assume that like local people are closer to, or indigenous people are closer to nature and somehow speak for.
Yeah. So this was a question about, and I'm going to paraphrase you.
Sure.
Isn't there a big danger of essentialization?
Yeah.
In thinking of this, and I would say absolutely. Most definitely, it's a big problem, right? You don't want to get all romantic about who anybody is, really. So I guess to me, I mean, I have a very unexciting message on that front, which is, move cautiously, think. I mean, this is. I do not know whether I succeeded, but this was a talk about combining theory and practice. Don't know if you noticed, but that was the goal, right? And to say like, all right, we have to keep our analytical hats on too, and we can't just go charging off on some romantic notion that, if it's indigenous, it must be good. But I guess what I think is that there is, to me, an inherent good in getting more voices in the room, even if they're voices I don't agree with.
Oh yeah, well, you did a wonderful talk. I enjoyed it very much, and in my mind, I started to think about something which I think is more uniquely American, United States, than Northern European, and that is the long tradition of anti-intellectualism. And so you have a whole movement in this country now where they don't believe in geology, they don't believe in climate science, they don't believe in vaccination. I mean, this is a complete denial, and it's this idea that I call the pride of ignorance. My view, if I have seen a program on television, I know as much about geography as you do. And so when you have a conversation with these people, it's impossible because they do not acknowledge. And could you relate that? Because this seems to be a long-term trend in this country, even before neoliberalism. Could you say something about that?
I guess what I'd say is, yes, clearly anti-intellectualism in the US plays into what's happening here, but when I talk with European colleagues, I hear very similar things about a sort of academic authority and being in kind of an embattled state, and market authority and the kind of insistence on relevance coming in very strongly. And so, my thought about this, which is, I think, perhaps not a very helpful thought, is that, in the same sense that I was trying to talk about science regimes being very particular to different places, like, this is one of the ways in which how it plays out in the US is very particular. But I feel that I'm hearing similar stories from other places. So there are clearly multiple, maybe it's overdetermined, but there are kind of clearly a bunch of different things coming in that are leading to very similar outcomes. Yeah.
Thank you, this is a great talk, and I appreciated you giving some thought to the what can we do and things like citational practices that are very much within our individual abilities. I, however, really do want academics to continue to try to tear down the authority of the commercial scientific regime, partly for my own benefit, because there's so many things that I rely on other scholars to study for me, because they're in areas that are not, that I don't know. I don't know the technology or the climate science or the toxicology without them there to explain it to me. On a personal level, and then even in my own academic writing, I've had recently a situation where there was a technical matter in dispute, and the industry said one thing and the activists said another, but the only citations I could go to were really industry citations, and so I ended up without much, since it was outside of my area of expertise on the technical questions, without having a lot that I could draw on to say, this is suspect, other than industry says this, and activists say this, and without actually weighing in on which one was likelier to be accurate. So I really want that information.
Absolutely, and what you're telling me is that I spoke in too broad strokes. So let me see if I can do this better a second time around. What I was specifically looking at were academic efforts to kind of go out and take on commercial knowledge producers, which I have not seen be successful at delegitimizing them in the eyes of, for example, public sector work, regulatory agencies, things like that. But producing studies that tell a different picture, I think, are incredibly effective, right? Because we need somebody saying, hey, actually there is lead in the water in Flint. Right? Yeah. So I think that kind of work is incredibly important. So I'm not saying stop researching important questions. I'm saying I think that is a more effective way of blocking things than actually trying to go out and say this study is bunk because what I have seen is that it has not changed practices in at least the natural resource agencies in the U.S. It hasn't changed EPA, it hasn't changed Fish and Wildlife, it hasn't changed NRCS, it hasn't changed the state agencies, right? It's not changing their policies at all. But I think that studies could actually do something. If you have data that you can put in front of people, it does a lot better than standing up and saying, this person is taking money from a coal company. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm trying to say. So I think you are 100% right, and I think I did not speak very carefully. Yeah. In the back.
Stand up, so I'm short.
Okay.
So I'm an archivist, and I'm interested in supporting the work that you all do. And special collections here at the University of Kentucky in particular, we have lots of political collections, community organizations, all of the things that you were talking about. And archivists take very seriously that what we collect impacts the knowledge of future generations and researchers moving forward.
If we don't go up there, we can't find it.
Right. Yeah. So it's this sort of a practical question, it's sort of a rhetorical question for the room: is how do I get you all to sit at the tables in my research room? How do I connect with you all so that you see all of the research projects that are just sitting there waiting for you to dive into? And how do I get back information from you all about what kinds of things we're not collecting that you all know about that we need to know that we need to go out and get?
Please, I'm going to open the room. You want to respond?
Well, just related to that, and I was going to ask this question anyway, but so in terms of archivists and the data we collect, the push by the national funding agencies, NIH, NSF, Landgrant Grant is now getting onto the bandwagon of data management, which includes data sharing and data preservation. And I think in terms of relevance, the bench sciences have been it's easy for them to follow that mandate, and all the social scientists I know get very hinky about, oh, sharing my data? No, I can't share my data. But like you said, how we define what data is, how we define assessments, how we define what the learning outcomes are, how we define what our data is that we are willing to share will make it more available to a variety of people. And so if we get on board with data sharing, it allows for things like working with archivists who can manage our data and share across projects that way. So I think other things we can do is actually to follow the mandate of data management, data sharing, and data preservation, and then find the communities you actively want to proactively share with. So indigenous communities or others, scholars that in the science field, for instance. So archivists are our friends. We should work with them. And NSF, by social scientists, putting our data in these data repositories allows the funding agencies to go to Congress and say, look, you know what? Social science is relevant. It's not just the bench sciences. We have people who are presenting their data.
Yeah. Other responses directly to this archive question first?
So I think this is a really core ethical question about the kinds of data that we produce and how those get tracked. And it relates directly to what you were saying. So for example, within the university spaces themselves, we're producing more and more data about how we're sustainable, like HE stars, LEED, right? You can kind of pile on all of these rating systems that we're subject to and the kinds of carbon that we're counting, how many water bottles we're using, electricity usage in each and every building, and it gets pretty scary, the detail of that amount of data. And I think that this is not decided yet, but I think that this is a really important ethical dialogue that needs to happen, because organizations are tapping into this overproduction of certain kinds of data, and then deploying that to reshape the spaces that we are using and working from. So, for example, National Association of Scholars, a right-wing funded group, has taken sustainability data generated by colleges like Middlebury College, for example, and others, that took their green sustainability data and then tried to launch a scathing kind of counterattack on how it's destroying or making the new environmental fundamentalism across campuses in the United States. And I also, like, working abroad, I think that the social scientists' concern when it's supporting one's own personal career is suspect. But I think that there are some really serious ethical questions about what gets shared, what we speak about, and which data we're using. And so producing more data with activists is good, but then who has access to that? I think really not decided. Anyways, thank you.
Other responses to the archive question?
I'm sitting on the floor.
This is great. Go.
Hi. To tag on that, separating from the data question, I think reconceiving the way we produce knowledge. So as academics in the academy, the focus is on peer-reviewed journals, but white papers, handouts, the sort of activist-oriented, publicly facing materials. I would never have even thought about an archivist, but that's so exciting. But I think part of like the way that we produce and share that knowledge, that's an interesting invitation.
I was just going to say that you can get an ISBN number. So if you do a report with a local group, especially graduate students, I think often will go in the summer and try to help somebody, and they think, well, it's not really part of my degree, but they'll help a local group prepare a report. Take that to your librarian, and you get an ISBN number, and all of a sudden everybody can find it. It's like the coolest thing.
I think not concern, I mean, I'm up for the idea of working with archivists and how do we then collaborate and make data, and make our projects actually more impactful. But one concern is that positionality is so important when it comes to collecting and interpreting qualitative data in particular. And so my concern is that once it leaves your hands, you no longer have that kind of embedded positionality, interpretation that you bring to it by using yourself as the instrument. And then I think it's your concern, even though you were talking about quantitative data, that you don't really know how it's going to be picked up and redeployed once it's out of your hands. And so one of the things that I would like to think through with archivists more generally is, what are the pieces of metadata or other kinds of data that we need to link to that, so that things like our positionality or interpretive analyses kind of are linked to it in ways that can't be separated.
I'm going to try to keep track of just the one, because I've had so many epiphanies in 5 minutes. Thank you so much. It's partly a comment about rethinking the archive that gets back to this really powerful point you were making about holding ourselves accountable to the conditions in which we're producing knowledge, because there are formal archives that are so rich, and then there's the everyday survival work that the people the most dispossessed, all of the memory and knowledge maintained in spaces that get least recognized, that are still feeding, right, that primitive accumulation is still taking all of that biological diversity knowledge produced in the other spaces, but insisting that they've been lost already. And so with those of us who are the most privileged because our job is to read, to write, to teach and talk to the students, to remind ourselves that we can't accept the premise that they've already been lost because there are actually existing contemporary people in colleges maintaining what we're feeding off of. And so with land-grant universities, in other contexts, like in Mexico where I work, where some land-grant universities were established by the French, and it was all about modernism, but all the people getting trained there were coming from peasant families, and so they didn't have to forget the way we did in the United States, that agriculture is revolutionary and small-scale work feeds most people. So it's peasants in those universities, and there are agri-ecology departments right now, really successful, vibrant ones, a lot of which are kind of serving as models for what the University of California system is doing, and some other places that happen in the US. But they still get undermined with the Puritan tendencies that academics can be really good at, and so they don't work with ag extension in many cases, or that their agri-ecology mission would be contaminated by doing the work that's actually getting out to more farmers who haven't adopted those genetically uniform varieties for recruit, right? So there's holding ourselves accountable for the compromised conditions in which what we admire most was produced, reminding ourselves we're not who live in that, like we're also already compromised, can be emancipatory, maybe. But there are land-grant universities that have major agri-ecology departments and people trying to do participatory breeding elsewhere too that we being touched on.
And striving for purity can be really, really paralyzing, right?
Yeah, I guess going on these last two comments, one of the things that I'm thinking about is a lot of times when we attempt to make our work relevant, there tends to be, when we go into, I guess, the more practical fields, a tendency to sometimes value quantitative work more so than qualitative work. And then this qualitative work, when we try to translate it over into quantitative indicators or measures, things tend to get siphoned off, distilled, and I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is how do we, number one, how do we make qualitative work more legitimate? Yep. Also, how do we do science? Thinking about science and thinking about relevancy, how do we change, or how do we go about it? How do we go about making this qualitative data still or continue to have its meaning when it's translated over?
Absolutely right. How do we keep it from losing all the nuance that makes it actually mean something, right? When you get, so this is something that I think about a lot, and I suspect a lot of people have more wisdom on this than I do, but I feel like it's got to be possible, right? Because I watch my natural science colleagues taking very complex findings and distilling them down into pieces that work and cutting it. I mean, so I absolutely agree with you that this is an issue. The review of my first book manuscript by a natural scientist came back and said, but there's no data. Literally. I mean, it was a really well-meaning review, but they were totally baffled. I mean, it was like layered with interview data, and they said, but how is this possible? There isn't any data, right? So I think you are 100% right. I guess I think that I think we have to figure out how to do it, one, and I think that necessity is breeding some skills that some people have already. And this is another thing where I feel, in addition to this question of what are techniques for maintaining kind of emancipatory political programs within universities, I think how we learn to soundbite what we do in ways that don't get rid of its meaning, as you said, like we got to learn that. And I think that there are people that know and we need workshops, which is kind of a punt of an answer, except to say that I am totally with you on this question. Yeah?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we're actually out of time. Sorry to have to wrap things up here, but we went a few minutes over. But I invite you guys to continue this conversation as we break for lunch and throughout the remainder of the conference. So thank you all for coming.